I'd like to welcome you to the 2018 Thomas H. Albright Christian Scholars Conference Abraham J. Malherbe Plenary Lecture featuring Cilliers Breytenbach, Professor for the Literature, History, and Religion of Early Christianity at Humboldt University in Berlin, Germany. The annual Abraham J. Malherbe Plenary honors the academic contributions and the legacy of Professor Malherbe, who was born in 1930 and passed away in 2012, Buckingham Professor Emeritus of New Testament Criticism and Interpretation at Yale Divinity School. It's made possible by the very generous endowment gifts from Abe's students and his friends and his colleagues and those who love and benefit from the standards of academic excellence that Abe established. Abe was an essential participant in helping root the Christian Scholars Conference in principles of faith and scholarship. Very pleased that his papers are archived here and on display during the conference. And with a rich history of Malherbe lectures, tonight's lecture aligns nicely within that tradition. Carl Holliday, Philip Jenkins, Michael Sandel, and last year Greg Sterling. And tonight, Cilliers Breytenbach, Christianity and Philosophy in Athens. But for a more proper introduction, there is no one better qualified to introduce Professor Breytenbach than Greg Sterling, who is the Reverend Henry L. Slack Dean of Yale Divinity School and Lillian Klaus Professor of New Testament. Greg is a New Testament scholar of the top order, with a specialty in Hellenistic Judaism, concentrating his research in the writings of Philo of Alexandria and Luke Acts. You hear people who would roll over in their grave if they heard of some terrible development that had been done in their name. This evening, I imagine Abe Malherbe standing up at this very moment and giving me that look to suggest that I quit talking and turn the microphone over to Greg Sterling and Cilliers Breytenbach.
We all saw that look. There are a handful of South African New Testament scholars who have become major figures in international scholarship. Abraham J. Malherbe was one, and our speaker today is another. A native of South Africa, Professor Breytenbach was educated at the University of Pretoria and then the Ludwig Maximilians Universität in Munich. His professional career mirrors his education. He began back in South Africa at the University of South Africa and then returned to his alma mater in Munich. But he wasn't there long before Berlin began to show a distinct interest in his work. 25 years ago, just 5 days after the Berlin Wall came down in 1993, Professor Breytenbach accepted a position at the Humboldt Universität zu Berlin. And there's a great story about this. The faculty at the Humboldt Universität voted to make him an offer on October 31st. He did not get the letter until 5 days after the wall, so about 14 days later. And somebody asked him, how are the negotiations going? He said, quite well, the wall has already come down. So if you're able to do that in negotiations, my hat's off to you. During his time at the Humboldt University, the city has been rebuilt. And as the city of Berlin has been transformed, he has helped to transform the faculty at that university into one of the strongest, and some could argue quite properly, the strongest New Testament faculty in Germany today. It doesn't hurt that the Theologische Fakultät, the building, sits immediately beside the Spree River, overlooking Museum Island that houses some of the world's greatest archaeological collections. I think of Horace's statement about literature, it is profit with delight. It's both beautiful and very impressive. Like the very best New Testament scholars, Professor Breytenbach has made contributions in multiple areas. The author of 5 monographs and the editor or co-editor of 12 scholarly volumes just since 2007, his edited volumes place him in what I call the Book a Year Club. The breadth of his coverage is as impressive as the quantity. His first monograph, which is based on his dissertation, was based on Mark, a gospel to which he has repeatedly returned and on which he is now completing a major commentary. His Habilitationsschrift addressed soteriology in Paul, a topic to which he has also returned on more than one occasion, including one of his monographs, which appeared in English, Grace, Reconciliation, Concord, the Death of Christ in Greco-Roman Metaphors. The last word in that title hints at another area of his expertise, metaphors and the use of language. His famous workshop, known as topoi, has addressed the use of metaphors at some length. Finally, he has been a significant figure in the use of material culture and the study of early Christianity. He edited the online collection of early Christian inscriptions from Asia Minor and Greece. He has also worked on specific areas and has a recent monograph on Lycaonia, which I believe is the first monograph devoted to that region. He is now turning his attention to Athens. Professor Breytenbach is keenly aware of Abe Malherbe's work. Abe's dissertation addressed Athenagoras. Today, Professor Breytenbach is going to return to Abe's intellectual beginnings with a talk entitled Christianity and Philosophy in Athens. Would you please join me in welcoming the Dean of New Testament Scholars from Germany to the Christian Scholars Conference.
Dear Greg, thank you very much for the very moving words. And thank you very much for all the organizers for the privilege to be able to stand here. Every one of us have our real mentors and examples in scholarship. And it is for me a moving privilege to be able to hold the Abe Malherbe, if you allow me to pronounce his name in that way, memorial lecture. The encounter between Christianity and Athenian philosophy started, according to the narrative of Acts 80:50, when Paul met Epicurean and Stoic philosophers. They took him and brought him to the Areopagus and asked him, "May we know what this new teaching is, what you are presenting?" This opened up a long dialogue between the teachers of Christianity and Athenian philosophers. It is not the intention of this paper to review the history of philosophical schools in Athens of late antiquity. Unfortunately, we are not very well informed about the interaction between Christianity and philosophy in Athens, and the sources, especially for the 3rd century, are lacking. Nevertheless, at least we have some evidence from the past about encounters between Christians from and in Athens. Christians who were in direct contact with the Athenian philosophical schools, Paul, of course, being the first one. Oh, that was too much. Good. In his splendid commentary on the text of Acts 17, Carl Holliday has noted that the Athens episode resumes the critique the Luke and Paul uttered towards idolatry in Lystra in Acts 40. It also supplements the picture of the beneficent Creator God. It tells that the Christian message is brought to the undisputed intellectual and cultural center of the Greek world, to quote Carl Holliday. We briefly rehearse what the narrative of Luke said. Paul was deeply distressed to see that the city was full of idols. Following his normal pattern, the author lets Paul dispute with the Jews in the synagogue and with the God-fearers. It is told that he also met Epicurean and Stoic philosophers. They called Paul a spermologos, a pejorative term for a person who lacks sophistication in communication skills and seems to pick up scraps of information here and there. They asked what the spermologos was saying. Some said Paul was preaching foreign divinities, daimonia. Luke's reason for this opinion is that Paul preached Jesus and the resurrection. This leads to Paul's sermon on the Areopagus, in which, to quote Carl Holliday again, biblical assumptions and imagery are blended with strands of pagan philosophical thought. Paul proclaimed, and I quote Acts, "The God who made the world and everything in it, who is the Lord of heaven and earth, does not live in shrines made by human hands, nor is he served by human hands as though he needed anything, since he himself gives to all mortals life and breath and all things. From one ancestor he made all nations to inhabit the whole world, and he allotted the times of their existence and the boundaries of the places where they would live." The speech culminates in the utterance that God raised Jesus from the dead. In the light of Athenian polytheism, Paul focuses on the message of the one Creator God who made all humans from a common ancestor. According to Luke, Paul's message was met by more doubt than acceptance by the philosophers. Luke tells that some of the addressees shook their heads, mocking Paul. Others wanted to hear him again. Consequently, Paul left them. But some of them joined Paul, and I quote again, "became believers, including Dionysius the Areopagite and a woman named Damaris, and others with them." Later, pseudepigraphic tradition made much of Dionysius, who went into the tradition as the first bishop of Athens. This, however, probably belongs to the realm of legend. All in all, the response was, so Carl Holliday, meager, though not insignificant, with the exceptional feature that in Athens there was no outright resistance to Paul's preaching and no subsequent persecution or harassment. Paul did not really succeed to convince the Athenian philosophers. After Paul's first unsuccessful attempt to convince the philosophers, Christianity's progress was slow. Athens was one of the last bulwarks against raising Christianity. So I come to 2nd century Christian apologist versus Greek culture. Since the 2nd century, Christian apologists and the authors of the Acts of, since the 2nd century, Christianity gained some support among the educated in the city, who went public with their writings addressed to the Roman emperors, as is demonstrated by the writings of the Athenian apologists Aristides and Athenagoras. In his chronicle, Eusebius placed Aristides in Athens. According to Eusebius and an Armenian fragment, the apology was addressed to Hadrian, whilst according to the Syriac translation from the 7th century, Aristides directed it to Antoninus Pius. As a solution, Robert Grant suggested, conceivably the original version is reflected in the Greek text, which was later revised and expanded for his successor Antoninus. The work begins with a semi-philosophical description of God and then shows that the gods of the various nations fall short. These are the Chaldeans, the Greeks, the Egyptians, and the Jews. The best are the Christians, who trace their genealogy back to Jesus Christ and practice pure love and benevolence. After summarizing Christian belief in the Trinity, Aristides describes Christian virtue in the language of the Decalogue and the teachings of Jesus. I quote an English translation of the Greek text, leaving the somewhat more expanded Syriac version aside. The Christians trace their origin from the Lord Jesus Christ, for they know God, the Creator and the fashioner of all things, through the only begotten Son and the Holy Spirit. And beside him they worship no other God. They have the commands of the Lord Jesus Christ himself graven upon their hearts, and they observe them, looking forward to the resurrection of the dead and life in the world to come. They do not commit adultery or fornication, nor bear false witness, nor covet the things of others. They honor father and mother. They love their neighbors. They judge justly. They never do to others what they would not wish to happen to themselves. They appeal to those who injure them, and they try to win them as friends. They are eager to do good to their enemies. From this passage about the virtues of the Christians, much can be inferred about the ethos and the practice of Christianity as Aristides saw it. Even if Aristides idealized Christianity, his praise of the Christians entails that they kept slaves, but that they accepted them as brothers and sisters in the Lord. They cared for the poor, in particular the widows and the orphans, delivered those imprisoned, buried those who died in poverty. They praised God in the morning and during the day. They thanked him for food and drink. From birth to the grave, life was enshrouded by their faith in God. The point is, and what, according to Aristides, spoke for the Christians in their Athenian environment, their ethical conduct. He juxtaposes this to the Greeks, who claim that there are many gods who came into being, male and female, masters in every passion and every variety of folly. The Greeks give name to gods who are no gods, to suit their own holy desires, I quote, in order that having them as patrons of vice, they might commit adultery and robbery and do murder and other shocking things. For if their gods did such deeds, why should not they also do them? As in the case of Paul's speech on the Areopagus, Aristides seeks common ground in the shared conception of God. Apart from the semi-Aristotelian discussion of God as the first mover and the controller of everything, who first established and now controls the universe, who is without beginning and without end, immortal and self-sufficient, above all passions and infirmities, above anger and forgetfulness and ignorance and the rest, Aristides is not engaging in philosophical discussion. He bases his apology for Christianity on the scriptures of the Christians and their conduct, which distinguishes them from the Chaldeans, the Greeks, and the Jews. Christianity supersedes Greek religion on the basis of moral conduct. The root of this difference lies in the difference between service to the one and the only triune God and the many human-like gods of the pantheon. In the tradition of Acts 17, they are harshly criticized. Athenagoras of Athens, a philosopher, as the title of the work states, wrote his Legatio Pro Christianis almost in 177 AD, dedicating it to the Emperor Marcus Aurelius and his son Commodus. Between 177 and 180, a number of speeches by embassies from the Greeks were delivered before the joint rulers. But there is no evidence, however, that Athenagoras' Paideia was delivered, and it could be considered as a piece of literary fiction. The line of defense Athenagoras' Legatio takes is that it is injustice if those who are called Christians, ho legomenoi Christianoi, when they are, although they did nothing wrong, are persecuted by many only because of their name. Through the apology, the emperors will learn that the Christians suffer without justice and beyond every law and reason. Like all others, they should be judged on the basis of their deeds. I quote, "We too ask for equal treatment for everyone, not to be hated and punished because we are called Christians. For how does a name accomplish vice? We ask to be judged on the basis of whatever someone might examine, and either to be discharged acquitted of the accusation, or to be punished convicted of wickedness, not on the basis of the name, but on the basis of wrongdoing." Athenagoras thus criticizes the practice of being convicted merely on the basis of being called Christian. This is against the laws that apply to any other group under Roman rule. In his supplication to the emperors on behalf of Christianity, Athenagoras undergirds his plea by demanding that everyone should be treated equally before the law, but he also compares Christian doctrine with philosophy. This strategy is understandable when one remembers that the legatio is addressed to Marcus Aurelius and his son Commodus, who are driven by philosophy and profound learning, as Athenagoras says. This is not the place to go into the philosophical background of Athenagoras' apology. Researchers, however, Abram Malaby, drew the attention to Athenagoras' indebtedness to pseudo-Plutarchian authors, and especially to Middle Platonism. Molding his argument on the Platonic understanding of philosophy, Athenagoras argues that Christians should be treated like philosophers. Before the law, philosophers are not judged upon their philosophical knowledge, their episteme. Athenagoras, and I quote, in effect claims that Christianity is philosophical, that it is episteme. He demands that Christians should be treated equally as philosophers. The name itself, Christian, should be freed from all accusation. When philosophers are accused, none of them appears good or bad to the judge before the trial because of his knowledge or skill. Only when he is shown to be guilty he is punished. He brings on himself no accusation because of his philosophy. Only if the philosopher breaks the law, then he can be convicted as evil. Knowledge itself is not to be blamed. Like philosophers, Christians should be judged upon their episteme or techne, their skill. They should be judged on the basis of their conduct. Their lives should be examined. For such a trial, Athenagoras has no fear. He even concedes that if somebody can prove that the Christians have done injustice, great or small, they do not decline to be punished, but agree to suffer the sharpest and merciless punishment. Conflating Matthew 5 and Luke 6 in his legatio, he takes the freedom to describe Christian conduct. They were brought up to love their enemies, to bless those who curse them, and to pray for those who persecute them, so that they may be sons of their Father in heaven, who makes his sun rise upon evil and good, and send rain on the just and the unjust. But why did the judges regard it an offense if somebody was called a Christian? According to Trajan's rescript on the letter of Pliny in AD 112, they could prove that they are not Christians by offering to the Roman gods. This brings us to the core of the charge against the Christians. Athenagoras seeks to contradict. The Christians are accused of atheism because they do not want to offer to the gods. The legatio sets out to refute the claim that the Christians are atheists and argues that they are not guilty of any injustice in their behavior. Athenagoras thus has to show that the charge of atheism is unfounded. The emperors tolerate various local cults. Referring to local Athenian practice, Athenagoras illustrates that also the Athenians are allowed to bring sacrifices and celebrate mysteries as they wish. To uphold traditional beliefs is thus not an offense. Why do the emperors discriminate against the Christians when they are so tolerant towards the Athenians, but also the Trojans, the Spartans, and even the Egyptians who regarded cats, crocodiles, snakes, vipers, and dogs as gods? If the Christians were atheists, that would be an offense. And the Athenians fairly accused Areopagus of atheism. But Christians are no atheists. They merely also claim the right to cherish their traditional beliefs, unlike Areopagus, who chopped up a wooden image of Heracles to cook his turnips. The Christians distinguish God from matter and show that matter is one thing and God another, and the difference between them is immense. For the divine is uncreated and eternal and can be contemplated only by thought and reason, whereas matter is created and perishable. As Malaby has illustrated, Athenagoras is drawing on Plato's Timaeus, denying the gods' real existence because they have beginning in time. Christians are wrongly persecuted and defamed, and Athenagoras is clear. Our doctrine teaches one God, the maker of everything, but that he is not created, because being does not originate, but not being originates. At great length, Athenagoras illustrates that the Attic tradition, from the tragedies to the philosophers, agrees that God is one. He then asks the questions, why are they allowed to utter their views while there is a law against the Christians? And the voices of the Christians are confirmed by the prophetic books. Athenagoras concludes that he has adequately illustrated that the Christians are no atheist, and presented to his readers a God who is uncreated and eternal, invisible, unchangeable, incomprehensible, illimitable, who can only be apprehended by mind and reason. This one and only God created, ordered, and sustains everything, topan. He does this through his word. Athenagoras' depiction of the Christian choice for a moderate, philanthropic way of life is not only on par with contemporary Middle Platonic idols, it is motivated by the belief in the Trinity and governed by an expectation of eschatological judgment. Christians believe that they are accountable for their life on earth before God, the Creator and eternal Judge. No one will escape the judgment of the triune God. To put it in the words of Abraham Malaby, they are guided by the knowledge of the Trinity and know that they are pure. The future cannot be described in words. Therefore, they love their enemies. They are exceeding philanthropists. Since there is nothing particular Athenian in the second theatris attributed to Athenagoras, his De Resurrectione, on the resurrection, we leave this writing aside, remembering that Abe Malaby was not convinced by those who claim that De Resurrectione was not written by Athenagoras. Athenagoras made ample use of Middle Platonic philosophy in his supplication for Christianity. Nevertheless, the basis of his argument is again an ethical one. One should judge Christians not on their name, but on their deeds. So, we turn to the next section. From the 2nd century onward, social and economic development in Athens was heavily dependent on the power of its educational institutions. The waning economy was heavily dependent on students from abroad, and leading teachers of the philosophical schools belonged to the urban elite. Through the centuries, Athens was elated when new philosophers or new students arrived. Philosophy and religion, however, were not juxtaposed, but went hand in hand. Apollonius of Tyana, pure in spiritual matters and knowing the right way to cultivate the god, on his arrival in Athens in the early 3rd century, first lectured on religion. The philosophical schools were an important part of the Athenian economy and public life, and it survived the onslaughts on the Athenians during the latter part of the 3rd century. The city outlived the Visigoth invasion of AD 267, leaving the influence of the philosophical schools and the rhetoricians unrelenting. Archaeological excavations suggest that Athens was not unscathed. Nevertheless, according to Zosimus' later narrative, the Athenians believed that it was the gods who saved the city, illustrating thereby the religious underpinning of the life in a city dominated by sophistic tradition. Legends that Athena and Achilles saved the city from being pillaged by the Visigoths indicated that by the end of the 3rd century, Athens was by no means a Christianized city. As far as the relations between Christianity and philosophy in Athens is concerned, the sources are unfortunately lacking. Enthusiasm to study in Athens prevailed in the 4th century. The famous Greek teacher of rhetoric, Libanius, by his own words tell us he would look past marriage with a goddess to see the smoke of Athens. His arrival in the city, however, was everything but welcoming. He was captured by middlemen and kept in a cell until he was willing to swear an oath, having agreed to pay certain sums of money to the heads of schools. Only then he became a regular student of Diophantus. So enrolling in the university was more complicated then. The enthusiasm of the new students who arrived to study in Athens and the way in which they gained access to teachers and schools are also expressed in Eunapius' autobiographical remarks. Writing by the end of the 4th century, he refers to the great enthusiasm at his own arrival at the house of the famous philosopher Prohairesius in Athens. The legends about Achilles as the guardian of the city were also sustained in the 4th century. Zosimus relates how Athens and Attica escaped the severe earthquake of 375, which destroyed the Peloponnese and all Greece. It was believed that by the favor of the hero Achilles, the Athenians and the country of Attica were freed from the earthquake. Every other place suffered. So reverence for the traditional gods made no way for the sophistic philosophers. The philosophical schools and traditional religion went hand in hand. From the end of the 3rd century into the 4th century, it was en vogue for young men to set out and study rhetoric and philosophy in Athens, the city in which both Greek myth and Neoplatonic philosophy were cherished. With students coming from all over the empire, in due course famous Athenian teachers were not from Athens or even from Greece, but from other parts of the empire. 2 men from the east, Julianus of Caesarea and the famous Armenian Prohairesius, became Athenian teachers. Libanius came from Antioch in Syria, Eunapius from Asia Minor. So let us look at Christian theologians and the Athenian Paideia in the 4th century. As far as Christianity is concerned, the reign of Constantine brought changes as from the 4th century. Christianity, who had been persecuted on basis of his name in the the 2nd century, and had to deal with a great persecution under Diocletian, was in a much better position under the reign of Constantine's Christian sons Constantius II and Constans. In this post-Constantinian context, young Christian students came to study in Athens. Gregory of Nazianzus and Basil of Caesarea, both from Cappadocia. They might have been attracted to study rhetoric in Athens not only by the city's fame, but also by the connections of such renowned Athenian teachers as Julian of Caesarea and the Armenian Prohairesius. So, Prohairesius, he was one of the most celebrated teachers in Athens as a Christian. He was favored by Constans and profited from the patronage of the Christian emperor. His career illustrates that after Constantine, Christians could rise to the higher echelons of the Athenian philosophical teachers. In Prohairesius' case, the backing from the Christian emperor Constans was more effective than the lobbying of rival teachers at the residence of the local governor. Although Prohairesius had to withstand several conflicts and had to leave Athens more than once, his reputation remained untarnished. No one less than Libanius wrote that on basis of his speeches, Prohairesius did well to the whole world. However, no work of him withstood the ages, and we are left with a hagiographic account of his life by his student Eunapius, who was not a Christian. After studying with Ulpian in Antioch, Prohairesius came in great poverty to Athens, where he rose to being the first and foremost student of Julian of Caesarea. In the end, he bequeathed his Athenian house to Prohairesius. Eunapius' rehearsal of the events after the death of Julian gives the modern reader a glimpse into the university politics of Athens. Eunapius only briefly notes that in the reign of Julian the Apostate, Prohairesius was shut out of the field of education because he was reputed to be a Christian. To the detriment of Prohairesius in Athens, from the outset of his reign, Julian favored Libanius in Antioch. It was through legislation, however, that Julian would harm Prohairesius most, by requiring formal certification of and information about all teachers. Julian ensured that he knew all Christian teachers and were able to find them. He thus could take comprehensive action against them by establishing a process through which the imperial government could collect the names of all professors. The law of June 362 laid the groundwork for Julian's subsequent action. According to his rescript on Christian teachers of June 362, Julian gave the teachers no choice. He gave them the choice to either criticize the Homeric and historic myths about the gods or to subscribe to them. Openly, they could not do that. So given the traditional critique of Christian polytheism, this put all Christian teachers in a very difficult situation. It would be absurd that men should teach the myths from Homer and Hesiod, whilst they do not believe that what they say on the gods to be sound. Under these circumstances, they hardly could teach any longer. Although exempted from this ruling, Prohairesius acted in solidarity with the other teachers. In his chronicle of the year 363, Hieronymus writes, Prohairesius, the Athenian sophist, abandoned his school of own accord after the enactment of the law which forbade Christians to teach the liberal arts. This was in spite of the fact that Julian made an exception for him so he could teach as a Christian. This is exceptional. If one takes the emperor's negative view on the Galileans into account. For him, their conduct is suspect. But even Julian must concede that the social outreach of the Christians is effective. The agape, where bread was shared, the hospitality towards foreigners, and the food provision for the poor led many to renounce the traditional Greek gods Julian observes. Although Eunapius, Proaresius' non-Christian student and biographer, left us with a clear picture of Proaresius' rhetorical mastery, the information on the content of his teaching is sparse, and there is almost no information on anything specific Christian to it. In the end, Proaresius is remembered for his skills as orator, for his virtuous life and sober lifestyle, and for the benevolence he showed to the Athenians to secure their access to grain. Proaresius' influence on Christian theology is only traceable indirectly via his students Basil of Caesarea and Gregory of Nazianzus. Of course, their study in Athens overlapped with that of Julian the Apostate and with Libanius. So let us turn to Gregory and Basil. In De Vita Sui and his biology on the burial of Basil, Gregory reflected on the share time in Athens. As far as their Christian commitment is concerned, others should tell how they behaved in fear of God, knowing first things are for the first, for God. In Athens, two ways were familiar to Basil and to himself, and where it led was not the same and not of the same value. I quote, "The first and more precious, leading us to our sacred buildings and the masters there." That must have been to the churches. "The second, and the one of less account, to our secular teachers." Thus, they were also instructed at the churches and firmly kept to their Christian identity. Our great concern, great name, was to be Christian and called Christians. Athens is harmful. In general, it is harmful to the things of the soul. They, however, strive to be lifted up to God and were not harmed, since their minds, and I quote, were protected by impenetrable armor. They were rather being confirmed in their faith by their experience, for they had to withstand the idolatry in the city. Finally, they left Athens, rhetorically equipped to teach their philosophy, Christianity. They call it philosophy. For a lifetime, Athens, their friendship's common home, bound Basil and Gregory together. But the letters of Basil, the epigrams of Gregory, and their other works tell us almost nothing about Christianity in Athens. John Christeson from Antioch was another famous theologian who briefly sojourned in Athens. He did this after he finished his studies under Libanius in Antioch, about after June 367. According to Gorgios of Alexandria, who wrote a Vita Chrysostom, Chrysostom wanted to close gaps in his education. With zeal, he studied the important text. Like a sponge absorbing water, he took in the teachings of the Athenians. He surpassed his fellow students, but the Athenians became jealous, not wanting a foreigner to exceed them in wisdom and knowledge. Demosthenes, the governor of the city, wanted John to address the assembly and even sent an entourage and a wagon to fetch him. Avoiding pretension, imposture, John decided to walk to the assembly in modesty. Taking the warnings of Mark 12:39 and Luke 11 as guidance, he took a seat not in the front, but high up at the back of the ranks, far from the nobility and the leaders of the philosophical schools in the front rows of the inner circle. The magistrate and the leaders had to beg him to join them. Under the rule of Christian emperors Valens and Valentinian I, the climate had changed, and the Athenian assembly had a more welcoming attitude towards Christian teachers. Nevertheless, throughout the story about John and the Athenians, John impresses with his humility, tapenophrosune, his virtue, arete, and his wisdom, Sophia. He learned from the Lord Jesus to clad himself in humility. The governor realizes that there is a huge difference between the instruction of the Greeks and that of the Christians. The lawmakers of the Greeks love power, philarchia, and disdain, whilst the Christian teachers teach humility, poverty, and that all people should share a frugal lifestyle. Georgios' narrative is specked with legend, and he styles the young John Christeson as the one who does what Paul could not do. He converts the leading representatives of the Athenian assembly to become Christian. The local bishop even wants to ordain John as his successor, but true to his ideal of humility, which John has learned from Christ, he returned secretly to Antioch to be baptized on Easter 386. By the end of the 4th century, Athens was still an attraction. Synesius, the Neoplatonic philosopher who became bishop of Ptolemais and Cyrenaica, wrote to his brother that a voyage to Athens would benefit him. I quote, "I shall not only gain this by my voyage to Athens and escape from my present evils, but also a relief from doing reverence to the learning of those who come back from Athens." Almost like Oxford. "They differ in no wise from our ordinary mortals, because they have seen, they differ in no wise from our ordinary mortals, but they do not understand Aristotle or Plato better than we. And nevertheless, they go about among us as demigods among mules, because they have seen the academy, the Lyceum, the Puikile, where Zeno gave his lectures on philosophy. However, the Puikile no longer deserves its name, for the proconsul has taken away all the pictures and has thus humiliated these men's pretensions to learning. So, Synesius' surgeon in Athens seems to have been displeased him. In another letter to his brother, he expresses his disappointment and curses the captain who brought him there by ship. At least in Synesius' opinion, Athens was heavily overrated. Through the 5th century, the philosophical schools were still the source of the city's prosperity. From about AD 410, an intense discussion of Plato's philosophy re-emerged for almost 120 years in Athens. The founder and first head of the new school was the wealthy Athenian Plutarchus. The school's considerable assets remained in private property of the respective scholar, a provision which assured the school's independence from the now Christian state. Neoplatonic scholastic peaked with Proclus' commentaries on Plato. For the Athens school, philosophy equaled religious worship, as it had for Plato. Consequently, the school became a center of intellectual opposition against politically triumphant Christianity. On the other hand, Christianity's influence on Athenian life also grew steadily since the beginning of the 5th century. Under Theodosius II, Athenian philosophers became increasingly under the influence of Christianity. This can be illustrated by the case of Aelia Athenais, also called Oidicea. Educated in Athens by her father, the rhetor Lontius, she married the Christian emperor Theodosius on the 7th of June, 421. So you can celebrate their wedding day today. Before the marriage, she was baptized and given the name Eudocia. Athenian philosophy, however, played its part to make this marriage possible. According to Malala's later narrative, it was the sophistication of Eudocia which moved Pulcheria, Theodosius' sister, to introduce her brother to her. I quote, "I found a young, very well-built, pure, well-behaved, eloquent Greek girl, a philosopher's daughter. In Athens, a statue would be put up for the now Christian empress as benefactress of the city. Together with her husband, she initiated the building of a basilica within the walls of the Library of Hadrian, enabling the Christians to worship in the city now. Local Christianity would now exercise influence in Athens when its efforts were backed by imperial forces. This does not mean that reverence for the traditional gods ceased. From Damascius' Vita Isidori, we learn that by 447, the Panathenea was still celebrated. In 484, the Asclepion was still frequented, since Plutarch of Athens begged an alternative cure from the statue of the Athenian Asclepius after he spent the night there. However, it is probable that Christian groups were co-responsible that during the second half of the 5th century, the Pan-Athenian festival ceased to be celebrated and that the cult statues of many temples were removed. In Proclus' times, the statue of Athena was removed from the pantheon, and I quote, by those who moved the things that should not move, meaning the Christians. And Proclus reports of his dream of the goddess asking him if she could move into his house. Some scholars even speculate that the vulture-like men responsible for Proclus' temporary exile from Athens were Christians. Around 515, Damascius returned to Athens to be the last head of the academy. Christianity rose and philosophy was declining, but some cultic practice was still intact. Damascius still saw the statue of Aphrodite put up by Herodes Atticus hundreds of years ago. However, the tide was turning, and in the course of time, Constantinople would become the Christian capital. In the new order of things, there was to be no significant place for Athens and none for polytheism. Local Christians' increasing influence on the emperors reached its pinnacle in 529 when Justinian I closed the Athenian philosophical school, inaugurating the decline of the city. Simplicus and the last scholar, Damascius, made their way to the Persian king, only to return disappointed to the Greek world a year later. The only place where the teaching of philosophy survived was among the Christianized Neoplatonists in Alexandria. From the 7th century onwards, believers chanted the Akathistos hymnos, while standing, praising the Theotokos, the Holy Virgin. Rejoice, vessel of the wisdom of God. Rejoice, who proves the philosophers fools. Rejoice, who breaks the webs of the Athenians. I come to the conclusion. Where does this tour de force through almost 4 centuries of relations between Christianity and philosophy in Athens take us? Initially, the dialogue started between the Lucan Paul and Stoicism and the Epicureans. But in due course, Middle Platonism was the stronger philosophical tradition in Athens and exercised influence on Athenagoras, Prohiresius, and on the Cappadocian Fathers. Christianity's belief in the one triune God was not incompatible with philosophical theology, be it of Aristotelian, Stoic, or even Middle Platonic grandeur. Christian theology Their belief in Trinity as the creator, savior, and sustainer of everything was the basis of their critique of Greek polytheism. This, however, was not what made Christianity attractive or gave the apologists reasons to defend Christianity. From the very first apology of Aristides, it was Christianity's ethos which furthered their cause. The impact of the care of the weak and the poor, their non-retaliation, their lifestyle had impressed even their harshest opponent, Julian the Apostate. Under Marcus Aurelius and Commodus, Athenian Christianity seems to have been persecuted. They were the victims of slander and ill will. They were named and blamed without having the opportunity to defend themselves on the basis of their conduct. Athenagoras' powerful plea for justice illustrates how important that is, not to work with the categories of religious profiling. It is a grave injustice which mocks the equality before the law. Athenagoras demanded from the emperors that Christians be judged before the court of law on the basis of individual behavior. We do not know if Marcus Aurelius or Commodus even heard or received his plea. But this message at the beginning of Christian self-defense was later forgotten by Christianity itself. Not to judge other groups on the basis of the group they belong to, but on the basis of their individual conduct. Even today, Athenagoras' plea must be heard by those responsible. Through the 4th centuries, Christianity's status changed from a belittled minority group to those who had the backing of the emperors in Constantinople. The persecuted group with a bad name changed into the representatives of the imperial religion. When we keep this in mind, it becomes clear that the triumph of Christianity, its power to break the web of the Athenians and to prove philosophy foolish, was fundamentally enhanced by the intervention of Constans on behalf of Proaresius and Justinian in closing down the new Platonic school in 529. The short intermezzo during the rule of Julian the Apostate prevented Christian teachers only temporarily to rise to the leading ranks of the sophistic teachers. But this is not the reason that there was no second Proaresius. Athens equipped Basil of Caesarea, Gregory of Nazianzus, and John Chrysostom of Antioch for their task. Gregorius' life of John Chrysostom does illustrate that the gifted Christian teachers led the philosophers into the church, to catechism and baptism, and did not strive to gain influence within the philosophical schools. Christianity outlived Athenian philosophy because the theologians kept to their task to teach their philosophy, Christianity, albeit with the help of philosophical training. This seems to me to be fundamental for the relationship between theology and the philosophy of any academy. Last but not least, Athenian Christianity judged itself and was judged by Athenians, as in the case of Basil, Gregory, and John Chrysostom, on basis of their lifestyle, their humility, their adherence to the ethic of non-retaliation, their care for the poor, their help to those that suffer, love for their enemies, that what they learned from Christ, that is what marked them. In the dialogue between philosophy and Christianity in Athens, this is what Christianity's strength was. And that will always be Christianity's strength. I thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Breytenbach, for this impressive overview, which touches on a very sensitive and simple question relating Christianity not just to philosophy, but to the larger culture. You now have your chance to pose questions. I'm going to ask that you do two things. Would you please identify yourself? I'll bring you the mic, and you can pose your question. And would you disguise your comment as a question? So, the floor is open. All right, well, maybe I'll ask the first question. So, it's interesting to me that Acts 17 has a fairly optimistic view of the place of philosophy as a forerunner to Christianity, in a sense. And I think of the statement of Philo of Alexandria, who said that philosophy is to the Greeks, or Clement said this, excuse me, philosophy is to the Greeks what the law is to the Jews. It leads people to the knowledge of God. But the tension that surfaced later in Athens suggests that maybe that was a bit optimistic. So could you just reflect a little bit on the view of philosophy in Acts 17? And as you've thought about this through the subsequent history, whether that outlook is justified or whether this is simply the outlook of an underrepresented group relating to a much larger culture?
Yes, I think if one thinks about the law leading people to God, of course it would be not correct to make a difference between the reverence for God and specific halachic traditions. So I think the ethic is included in that part of the statement. As far as Acts 17 is concerned, the opposition is of course against the many gods, the polytheism of the Athenians, which is what shocks Paul almost, if you read the text. And this is the context in which these discussions take place. We do not have a context in Athens, and that one could see through all the centuries, that the traditional gods were not revered, not by the philosophers, as I said, Plutarchus of Athens goes into the Asclepion. There are others by Proclus and so on. They keep serving the gods. So the Christian argument that, well, we are giving reverence to the one and only triune God, there is only one God, I think could not really make a point in defense other than defending them against the acquisition that they are atheists in order to find a place in society. It was not done through their, shall I say, philosophically underpinned way of talking about God, but in their practiced ethical conduct towards the other inhabitants of the city.
Okay.
My name is Tom Robinson from New York City. I am interested in the 4th century when Basil, Caesarea, and Gregory Nazianzus, both of whom are relatively aristocratic young men, go to Athens and study. In approximately the same time, you have Julian the Apostate, not yet apostate, but young man, the young prince, studying there. And Julian becomes a person who really believes that great philosophical tradition does not belong to the Christians and thus bans them from teaching. And whereas Basil and Gregory, they live that philosophy as a Christian philosophy. But then you have Theodosius, who comes in and is a true believer, sort of like like Julian the Apostate and overthrows that. I'm interested in that struggle over who does the philosophic tradition belong to, that Julian so forcefully wanted the Christians not to be able to claim the great Greek philosophical tradition. At least maybe that's a misreading, but that's sort of as it seemed. And then Theodosius pushing through the Christianization of the universities in Athens.
Yeah. Well, you cannot really say he pushes through the Christianization. He closes them down. Yeah. You know. So because I think they was the last bulwark against Christianity. And as I say, it's interesting to see this fairly unknown text of Georgius on John Chrysostom, that the assembly then asked, what should we do? And he say, well, let me take you to the bishop. And he takes them to catechesis and to be baptized. He does not say, okay, let's make up an alternative teaching place. I think that's important. And then the bishop wants to keep him in Athens to be his successor, and he goes back where he think he should belong to Antioch. So I think the tide is turned. It has to do with, I think, I'm not an expert on Julian, but I think Julian tried to turn the clock back. And the influence of the other sons of Constantine was just then stronger with, shall I say, Theodosius on the beginning, after the other two, Constans, and then Theodosius comes, and in the end, Justinian, I think, puts through what was, if you were looking for a reason, the literature says, well, that is also Constantinople exercising its power to be the intellectual center of the empire, to sideline the philosophical school by practically closing it. And because it was such an important source of income, it leads to even the further decline of the city after the closing of the schools in 529.
John.
Thank you for a very stimulating talk. My name is John Fitzgerald from Notre Dame. I want to go back to Acts 17, and I'd ask a question that I think Abe might ask. The Paul of Acts begins his remarks on the Areopagus by commenting on the altar to the unknown God, and that is seen as a mark of their desedaimonia. And is that aspect, that characteristic of the Athenians, is this picked up in any of the subsequent conversations? And I ask that in part because it was Abe who introduced me to Theophrastus and his discussion of the superstitious or religious person. And thus, I'm curious as to whether that trait gets picked up or is completely ignored in the later discussions.
I'm afraid, as far as I know, not. As I say, the evidence on dialogue between Christianity and philosophy in Athens is about that what I presented to you, unless I, have missed really something important. So you could maybe look, and somebody, there are people who did that, but maybe not in this systematic way. Somebody should really go and read the Cappadocians and John Chrysostom against the writings of philosophers that were based in Athens and had their training in Athens, but specifically in Athens, shall I say, background and dialogue. Maybe then you would find something that you can say, well, that's where they got it. But they do not say anything about Athens more than I have referred here. There's a few small remarks, but that do not really change it. As far as Acts 17 is concerned, Acts 17 takes up a strategy that was already in Acts 14, where the Acts of Paul, the Paul of Acts start with the reverence of Zeus and Hermes, which was a local tradition in the area. And in the same sense, we know that the altar for the unknown god was a local tradition in Athens. I think this has to do with the way in which Luke tells his story. And I cannot see that this motive was taken up by anyone in defense of Christianity, albeit that Athenagoras' defense and the defense of Aristides. Aristides, in his semi-philosophical argument, take up clearly Aristotelian conceptions of God, as Athenagoras takes up Middle Platonic conceptions of God to depict the Christian God. So in that sense, you could say it is an analogy.
Okay, I think we're just about out of time. I hope you will join me in thanking Professor Breytenbach. The challenge of this is to think not only about the relationship between Christianity and philosophy in a half of millennium, but to think about the relationship between Christianity and philosophy more broadly, and the relationship between Christianity and the larger culture, with philosophy being a particular aspect or venue in which we relate to that larger culture. So as I sat and listened, what I was thinking about were some of the debates that occur in this country and the relationship between Christianity and our culture in this country and those who want to identify it, and some of the problems that we can see around the world in what we talk about when we speak of colonialism in other places. But these are acute problems. They have been with us for centuries, and it pays us well to think about how these relationships were negotiated in the past, whether they were fought over or whether there were syntheses, and what we can learn as we contemplate our place in the 21st century. So, it's the end of a long day. Everybody's exhausted. You probably would like to eat, and I think dinner is going to be waiting in just a few minutes. So there's shows tonight, tokens is tonight, things for you to do. Enjoy one another's company, and thank you again, Cilliers, for a wonderful lecture.